Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Seriously, just take a look around you for a second. Screens are just, well, they're everywhere, aren't they?
Absolutely. In our pockets, on our wrists.
Exactly. On buses, trains, you see faces lit up. Even babies, still learning to sit up properly, are using them.
Yeah, it's become completely ubiquitous. Hard to imagine life without them now.
It really is. And that undeniable presence, it got us thinking, what is all this constant digital stuff doing to the very youngest among us? The ones in those crucial early years of development.
It's probably one of the biggest questions out there right now for parents, for educators, researchers, everyone, really.
Right.
We know those early years are just so critical for shaping, everything that comes later. And screens are this relatively new and pretty powerful factor in that whole sensitive equation.
Exactly. And you came to us with a stack of sources, didn't you?
Mm.
Articles, research papers, analyses, all trying to get a handle on this exact question.
Yeah, trying to piece together what we actually know.
So for this deep dive, our mission is pretty clear.
Uh-huh.
We're going to crack these open, pull out the most important bits, the key insights, and help you get a really clear, informed picture of what the research is telling us right now about screen time and young kids' development.
And just a heads up, it's not going to be a simple screens are all bad kind of story. Not
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of nuance here. You'll see the impact really depends heavily on, who is using the screen, what they're actually watching or doing on it, and the whole context surrounding that use.
Ah, okay. That's where it gets really interesting then.
Right.
Right, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it. Maybe we should start with the human foundation, because that first source you shared, human touch first and foremost, it really hammers home something fundamental, something we might overlook.
Okay.
It basically reminds us that we humans were biologically wired for very specific kinds of early experiences.
Right, I remember that. It makes the case that having a loving, face-to-face, consistent relationship with a main caregiver, it's not just like nice to have, it's critical, the absolute bedrock.
Precisely. The young brain is literally being sculpted by those in-person interactions. It's primed to learn from all those subtle cues, a smile, a tone of voice,
Yeah.
eye contact.
Yeah.
And if those foundational interactions aren't consistent, or worse, if they get replaced by something else,
Mm.
well, that can seriously impact how a child's brain architecture develops.
And that period, birth to about 5 years old, that's described as this incredibly critical window, isn't it?
Hugely critical, yeah.
This is when the groundwork gets laid for, well, everything. Emotional regulation, empathy, executive function, social skills,
Yeah.
even attention span and how well they do in school later on.
Yes, that source is starkly clear about it. These in-your-face, hands-on relationships, as they put it, they are the main way children learn about the world. It's how they build resilience, develop vital skills like, reading faces or understanding how people interact. The big risk it highlights is when technology starts to supplant those essential human interactions, pushes them aside.
Yeah, I was really struck by some of the anecdotes in that source.
Yeah.
Like picturing parents just absorbed in their phones at school pickup
Mm-hmm.
and the kids either desperately trying to get their attention or just giving up, sort of retreating. It paints a really vivid picture of that displacement you mentioned.
It does. And the source connects this wider struggle we all have, this constant digital pull on adults too, connects it to some worrying trends like rising mental health issues in young children.
Really? Even that young?
Yeah, it mentions things like more kids being expelled from preschool for behavior issues, rising rates of ADHD, depression, anxiety, even in that very young age group.
Wow. Which makes you wonder how often devices get used, not for something specific or educational,
Yeah.
but just to manage behavior,
That's
right?
right.
To keep a child quiet or act as a sort of instant babysitter. That's a direct swap for potential interaction time.
Exactly. And the really powerful message from that source is that fixing this isn't about fancy gadgets or complicated programs. The most impactful interactions are often the simplest ones, the everyday things,
Like what?
like talking about the shape of a tomato at the supermarket or just smiling back when your child grins at you, making up silly stories during bath time. You know, those foundational, hands-on, human-to-human moments, they're incredibly powerful and they cost nothing. The core message is just crystal clear. Relationships built through real-world interaction are absolutely paramount, especially in those first few years.
Okay. So keeping that vital human foundation firmly in mind, let's pivot to the broader research. You brought in this big systematic review from the Journal of Pediatric and Neonatal Individualized Medicine, right? Synthesizing a lot of studies on screen time.
Yes, this review is really helpful because it pulled together findings from 85 different observational studies published over 20 years from 16 countries looking at kids from birth up to 9 years old.
85 studies. Wow.
Yeah, and they were looking specifically for links between screen time and those key developmental areas we just talked about, socio-emotional stuff, executive functions, thinking skills, language, motor skills.
Synthesizing that, many studies must be tough.
Yeah.
I imagine they all measure screen time differently and look at slightly different things.
Oh, absolutely. That's a challenge. But they looked for overall patterns, and the overarching finding, it was that screen time was generally associated with poorer outcomes across most of the areas they looked at.
Poorer outcomes for socio-emotional skills, executive functions, cognition, motor skills.
Okay.
So a general trend leaning negative.
Mostly, yes.
Were there any areas where the picture looked different or more mixed?
Yes, language actually stood out as being a bit more mixed. While, plenty of studies still found negative links, fewer than half of the studies specifically focused on language actually supported that negative effect.
Interesting. Okay, maybe let's break that down a bit.
Uh-huh.
Can we look at the findings for some specific areas? Maybe not every single number, but the gist of what the review found across all those studies. What about socio-emotional functions?
Sure. So looking across the 44 studies focused on socio-emotional functions, the overwhelming weight of the evidence pointed towards excessive screen time having a detrimental effect.
Okay, detrimental how?
Well, showing up in things like poor social skills, trouble with emotional regulation, kids struggling with self-control, and just overall psychological well-being. Now, a few studies didn't find a link, and maybe one or two found some limited positive effects, sometimes depending on the specific type of game, for example. But the strong consensus from this review is definitely that excessive screen time is linked to negative socio-emotional development.
Right. That lines up pretty closely with the concerns from that human touch source, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Okay, what about executive functions? Things like attention and self-control.
Similar story, really. For the 30 studies on executive functions, the clear majority found detrimental effects. So impacts on a child's ability to, say, inhibit impulses, sustain their attention, manage their own learning and behavior. Again, a significant number found no link, but the overall trend was towards negative impacts. The review did note here, though, that some child-directed educational programs sometimes showed positive associations, whereas just having the TV on in the background, that was consistently linked to worse outcomes for executive functions.
So content and context popping up again, even in these broad findings. Okay, language. You said that was more mixed. Can you elaborate?
Yes, language was studied a lot, 29 studies, but the findings were less consistently negative compared to those other areas. While, yes, a substantial number, about 13, did link screen time to things like poorer communication skills, smaller vocabularies, or a higher chance of language delays.
Okay.
A notable number, 8, found no correlation at all, and crucially, 7 studies actually found beneficial effects.
Beneficial, really?
Yeah.
Under what kinds of conditions?
Yeah. Well, these positive effects often seem to depend on things like having an adult involved, watching high-quality educational content designed to boost language, or maybe screen time that was more active or interactive. The review pointed out that whether the content was genuinely informative and aimed at kids versus just general TV programming seemed to make a big difference for language outcomes.
Got it. So again, it's not just that screens are used, but how, especially for language, how about cognition? Thinking skills, school achievement.
For cognition, 16 studies looked at this more than half, so 9 studies, found a negative association with screen time, things like math skills, general school achievement.
Okay.
A couple found no effect. And then 3 studies did suggest potential benefits, for instance, with reading or letter knowledge, especially when adults were involved, that co-viewing idea again. And here, too, the review mentioned mixed results, depending on whether content was educational or general, and the type of screen time. Passive viewing seemed linked to worse math skills in one study, while active screen use was linked to better science knowledge.
It really seems like across these thinking areas, any positive findings are often conditional. Depends on the content, depends on the interaction. Okay, last one, motor skills.
Motor skills were looked at in fewer studies, only 9. But of those, 2/3, so 6 studies, found detrimental effects on things like gross motor skills, overall coordination. A couple found no link. But interestingly, one study did find a positive effect specifically for interactive electronic games on certain skills, like object control.
Okay, so the review paints this picture. General trend across many areas points to an association with poorer outcomes, especially with excessive use. But there are really important variations and nuances, especially around language, and heavily dependent on the type of content and interaction.
Exactly.
And the review also mentioned that the quality of the studies themselves varied, right, in how they were done.
Yes, that's a really important piece of context. They pointed out that the studies had varying methodological quality, some rated good, some fair, some poor. And there were significant differences in how studies were designed and run,
Right.
which basically means while the review gives us a valuable snapshot of the overall landscape, we need to interpret the results with a degree of caution. It really highlights just how complex this field of research is.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about those fundamental human needs. We've looked at the broad brushstrokes from the research synthesis. But like you said right at the start, it's not just about how much time.
No,
And this is where the other sources you brought, like Screen Sense and that COI2 report, really dive into the why and the when, all those crucial nuances.
exactly. And ScreenSense actually offers a really useful framework for thinking about this. It introduces the 3 Cs.
Three C's.
Yeah. The idea is that the effect of screen media isn't just about the screen itself. It's about the child, the content, and the context. Understanding those 3 pieces is crucial.
Okay, child, content, context. Let's break those down. Start with the child.
Okay, so the child refers to all those individual differences. A child's age, their unique personality or temperament, their attention span, what they're naturally interested in, even their mood at the time.
Makes sense.
But a really critical concept, especially for the very youngest kids, is something called the transfer deficit. Both ScreenSense and the COI2 report discuss this.
The transfer deficit. Okay, that sounds important. What does it mean?
It basically means that young children, especially kids under 3, learn far less effectively from a flat 2-dimensional screen than they do from a real-life, hands-on 3-dimensional interaction.
Ah, okay.
They might be able to imitate something they see on a screen, maybe even days later. But applying that knowledge, transferring it from the flat screen to the actual physical world around them, that's much, much harder for them.
So like seeing how a puzzle works on a tablet might not actually help them figure out the real physical puzzle.
Precisely. ScreenSense gives an example where toddlers are shown on video where a toy is hidden in a room. They often fail to find it in the actual room, even though they can easily find it if someone shows them in person.
Huh.
And this deficit seems to exist even with interactive tablets. The act of just manipulating the device itself might add extra cognitive load that actually interferes with learning and transferring that information.
Is there any type of screen interaction that seems to overcome this deficit then?
Yes, actually. Video chat seems to be the main exception.
Why is that?
Primarily because it's fundamentally socially interactive. Learning new words or actions from, say, a grandparent or a familiar adult via video chat seems to be about as effective for toddlers around age 2 as learning face-to-face. That social connection makes a real difference.
Okay, interesting. So that's the child, and the transfer deficit is key there. What about the second C, content? This seems kind of obvious. What they watch matters.
It matters enormously, yes. And multiple sources hammer this point home. High-quality educational content, especially programs specifically designed for young kids.
Like the ones mentioned, PBS Kids, Sesame Workshop.
Exactly, those kinds of things mentioned in ScreenSense and the recommendations. That type of content is consistently linked to better outcomes for language, for cognition, for executive functions.
Right.
On the flip side, really fast-paced, fantastical entertainment, the example ScreenSense uses, is SpongeBob. That's actually been shown to negatively impact preschoolers' executive functions right after watching, possibly because it's just too cognitively taxing for them.
And then there's the difference between passive viewing and interactive content.
Right. Now, the research review we talked about showed kind of mixed results overall, but it did hint that interactive games might have benefits for motor skills, remember?
Yeah.
And active screen time was linked to better outcomes than passive viewing in some cognitive areas. ScreenSense also notes that using an interactive tablet could potentially be different from just passively watching a video, although the complexity of the content on the tablet itself can still be a challenge for learning.
And ScreenSense also gave us that really helpful acronym for what makes content learnable. E-AIMS.
Yes, E-AIMS. It stands for engaging, actively involved, meaningful, and social.
Okay.
So content that is truly engaging for the child, where they feel actively involved, not just zoning out, that is meaningful. So connected to their real life, maybe using familiar characters like Elmo helps here. And ideally is social, either promotes interaction or, even better, is viewed with an adult. That's the kind of content children learn best from.
Engaging, actively involved, meaningful, social. Got it.
Oh, and repetition can also help younger kids, especially. It might help them process and learn, potentially overcoming that transfer deficit a bit as they pick up different things each time they watch.
That's a fantastic checklist, E-aims. Okay, finally, the third C, context. This feels like where a lot of the practical stuff comes in, including that idea of what screen time is replacing.
Absolutely. This is where that time displacement theory, mentioned in the review in the Koi-2 report, becomes really critical. If a child is spending hours on screens, what are they not doing?
Well, all the things we know are essential, right?
Mm,
Active play, exploring things hands-on, actual social interaction with other kids and adults, physical activity, and sleep.
exactly. Human touch, first and foremost. And the review both pointed out that link between less physical activity because of screen time and a higher risk of obesity later on.
Hmm.
And the Koi-2 report highlights that screen time, especially right before bed, is associated with a shorter sleep duration. And we know lack of sleep impacts just about everything: mood, behavior, learning.
And it's not just that it eats into sleep time. The screens themselves actually interfere with sleep, don't they?
They do. Screen Sense explains that the blue light that screens emit suppresses melatonin production. That's the hormone that helps us feel sleepy, so it makes it physically harder to fall asleep.
Right.
Plus, watching stimulating or, say, violent content before bed is also linked to sleep problems.
There.
So the timing of screen use within a child's day is a really key part of the context.
And that obesity link, it's not just about less running around, is it?
Yeah.
Screen Sense brought up food intake while watching, and crucially, the advertising exposure.
Yes, that's a huge point, especially for young kids, say under 4 or 5, who literally can't tell the difference between the show and the commercial.
Ah, yeah.
Constant exposure to ads for often sugary or fatty foods
Yeah.
directly influences what they prefer and what they ask for. And having a TV in the child's bedroom, that's flagged as a big risk factor for both more screen time and higher obesity rates.
Wow. Okay, so context includes health habits like sleep and diet, but it also covers the social environment. And, crucially, adult behavior comes into play here, too.
Absolutely. Which brings us to technoference. That's the term used in Screen Sense. And the Koi-2 report for when a parent's own device use interrupts their interaction with their child.
Right, I remember that. ScreenSense shared that really troubling study. Was it in a fast food restaurant?
Yes. Parents engrossed in their phones tended to have kids who acted out more, seemingly to get attention,
Mm-hmm.
and then the parents reacted more harshly to that behavior. It's a negative cycle.
Or that other study mentioned in ScreenSense where just a parent taking a brief phone call during a task designed to teach a toddler a new word, it meant the child was less likely to actually learn the word. Even short interruptions matter.
They really do. And then there's the issue of background TV. Screen Sense notes it's incredibly common, something like over 5 hours a day on average in U.S. homes with toddlers just on in the background, not actively being watched.
And that's just constant distraction, isn't it? It's rarely educational for a little one, and it directly interferes with language development and thinking because it reduces the amount of conversation and play between the adult and child. The Koi-2 report points that out too.
But there's a positive flip side to technoference and background noise, and that's joint media engagement, JME.
Right, which the sources seem very positive about.
Very positive, yes. When adults actively watch or use screens with their children, it totally changes the dynamic. It can significantly enhance learning.
How so?
Well, the parent or caregiver can narrate what's happening, point things out, label objects, ask questions, connect the screen content to the child's actual life. Basically, they help the child process and understand what they're seeing. It's like building a bridge.
Scaffolding their understanding.
Exactly. It makes a huge difference in helping kids actually learn from screens and then transfer that knowledge to the real world. But as ScreenSense notes, it seems to be a missed opportunity for many families who might use screens near their kids, but don't actually co-view or engage together.
And setting limits. That's another obvious but important part of the context, right?
Definitely. The research review found that when parents set restrictions on screen time, it was linked to more positive social skills in their children.
Okay.
And specifically keeping screens out of bedrooms or turning them off well before bedtime, that's consistently linked to better sleep duration and also reduced obesity risk, according to ScreenSense and Koi-2.
Okay. So we've built up this really detailed picture, starting with that essential human foundation, looking at the broad research trends, and now diving deep into these crucial nuances. The child, the content, and the context, especially for young children. But what about older kids, teenagers. The Coit-2 report touched on those age groups briefly, didn't it?
It did, yeah. The focus shifts a bit as children get older. For kids aged, say, 5 to 12, screen use tends to become more independent. You see more internet use, more gaming.
Yeah.
The principles of content and context are still really key. Passive viewing, still generally linked to negative outcomes. But interactive use might potentially be positive for certain skills, maybe science or language knowledge, even if it's linked to negative outcomes in other areas like math or executive functions in some studies. It's complex.
And school use adds to the total time, too.
Right. School-based screen use adds up, and the academic results seem pretty mixed, really depending on how teachers implement it. Social and emotional outcomes also seem to depend a lot on the social dynamics around that school use, and timing, especially around sleep and homework, that remains important.
Okay. And then for adolescents, teenagers, the digital world shifts again more towards the internet and social media.
Yes, exactly. And the Coit-2 report introduces an interesting idea here, the Goldilocks hypothesis.
Goldilocks, like not too much, not too little.
Kinda. It suggests that for teenagers, some screen use is probably better than none, especially for social connection. But too much use could be mildly detrimental to things like mood, anxiety, self-esteem.
How much is too much, though?
Well, that's where it gets fuzzy. The report notes researchers really debate that, with estimates varying wildly anywhere from around 2 hours a day to over 7 hours. It just highlights how complex it is and how much individual variation there likely is.
And social media itself.
Yeah.
That seems like a whole other kettle of fish, with its own mix of potential upsides and clear downsides for teens.
Absolutely. The benefits can be real, fostering connection, finding a sense of belonging, even getting little self-esteem boosts from positive interactions like likes or comments.
Sure.
But the downsides are significant too. That constant social comparison, often with highly curated, unrealistic images, the fear of missing out or FOMO, exposure to inappropriate content, and maybe most critically, cyberbullying.
Yeah.
The Coit-2 report makes a very important point here. It says that while the research hasn't consistently shown that typical social media use causes anxiety or depression, cyberbullying is a stark exception. There's strong evidence showing it can have really serious negative consequences.
That feels like a really crucial distinction to make. And the report also mentioned something called problematic internet use. This is a separate issue.
Right. That's seen as a more extreme pattern of internet use, one that can be linked to cognitive problems, higher rates of anxiety and depression, sleep issues. It's still an area researchers are actively trying to understand, is it a cause or maybe a symptom of these other problems?
Okay. So pulling all of this together now, the basic human needs, the research findings, all these crucial nuances across different ages. What are the practical takeaways? How should you listening navigate this incredibly complex digital world based on these sources?
Yeah.
The Coit-2 report mentioned different countries have different approaches, which is interesting.
Yes, it highlighted that contrast. You have some places, like the New Zealand guidelines mentioned, that set relatively strict universal time limits, like 0 passive screen time, less than an hour for 2 to 5-year-olds, and so on. Versus approaches you see more in, say, the US and the UK. These tend to take a more nuanced view. They distinguish more between different types of content and context, and often recommend that families set their own limits based on whether screen time seems to be interfering with other important parts of life.
Like sleep, physical activity, family time, schoolwork.
Exactly. Is it getting in the way of those things?
Which feels much more aligned with that 3 C's framework we talked about. It's not just about the minutes on the clock, it's about the overall impact.
Precisely. The idea is that making informed, mindful decisions based on your individual child, the content they're consuming, and the context they're consuming it in, that's ultimately more effective than just rigidly enforcing a timer, especially as kids get older.
Okay, so what are some concrete recommendations we can pull for these sources for parents and caregivers? Let's try and summarize.
Okay. For the very youngest kids, say under 2 years old, the strongest message across the board is really to avoid passive screen time altogether.
Just avoid it.
Yeah. Prioritize face-to-face human interaction, hands-on play above everything else. And critically, be mindful of your own device. Avoid that technoference.
Okay, what about for preschoolers? Ages 2 to 5, roughly.
The advice shifts towards being very deliberate about content. Choose high-quality educational stuff designed for their age. And the absolute golden rule here seems to be Joint media engagement, watch with them, use screens
Make
together.
it interactive.
Yes. Make it a language-rich, interactive experience. Talk about what you're seeing, ask questions, connect it back to their real world. Also build daily routines that really prioritize connection and definitely turn off that background media that's just noise.
Good advice.
Yeah.
And for older children, school-age kids.
Monitoring content becomes more important. Using parental controls, yes, but also having conversations about what they're seeing and doing online. Encourage interactive screen use like creative apps, educational games over just passive consumption, and focus heavily on making sure there's a real balance with all those other vital activities. Sports, hobbies, time with friends, family time, reading, playing outside. Setting clear limits is still key, especially around bedtime. Ideally, no personal devices in bedrooms overnight.
Right. And finally, for teenagers.
The emphasis really shifts towards open communication and guidance. Talk openly with them about the potential pitfalls of social media, that pressure of comparison, unrealistic images, the risk of harmful content, and especially hammer home the very real danger of cyberbullying.
Really emphasize that one.
Absolutely. And just check in with them regularly, ask about their online experiences, see how they're doing overall.
And across all these ages, seeking out and choosing high-quality content. That's a constant theme, isn't it?
It really is. Sources like PB Skids, Sesame Workshop, resources like commonsensemedia.org, they're mentioned as good places to find age-appropriate, educational, potentially beneficial stuff. The overall goal, if screens are being used, seems to be making that time as meaningful, interactive, and social as possible, moving away from just passive, solitary watching.
Wow, okay. That really was a deep dive, wasn't it? From the fundamental way human brains develop through the big picture of the research and drilling right down into those crucial nuances of the child, the content, and the context.
Yeah, and I think that the key takeaway isn't really a simple rule like screen's bad or even just a number on a timer. It's actually about understanding the absolutely critical importance of that early human interaction for development and recognizing that screens, especially when used passively, excessively, or in isolation, can unfortunately displace those vital foundational experiences.
Right. And that when screens are part of a child's life, it's the child, the content, and the context, those three C's, that really determine the impact. Making informed, mindful decisions based on those factors seems far more useful than just obsessing over the total minutes.
It really requires conscious choices, doesn't it? A recognition that at the end of the day, human connection and real-world, hands-on experiences, they remain the absolute gold standard for how young brains learn, grow, and build resilience.
So in a world where screens are, let's face it, only going to become more integrated into everything we do, that leaves us, and you listening, with maybe the most important question to think about. How do we make sure these incredibly powerful tools truly serve us, and more critically, serve the developing brains and relationships of our children, instead of letting them accidentally erode those essential human connections that young brains need most? What does finding that true balance really look like for your family?